When billionaire Victoria Sterling cornered Jake at her daughter's college graduation and told him he wasn't worthy of her child, the carpenter's quiet response about what he'd learned from losing everything made her realize she was about to lose the most important thing in her own life. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story, and leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear your story too. The champagne bubbled in crystal flutes as New York's elite mingled beneath the soaring glass ceiling of Columbia's business school atrium. Jake Martinez stood near the edge of the reception, watching Emma laugh with her classmates, her cap tilted at that slightly rebellious angle she always wore when she was trying not to look too perfect. The late afternoon sun caught the highlights in her auburn hair, and for a moment, he forgot he was wearing his only good suit, the navy one. He'd bought second-hand for his wife's funeral 8 years ago and had tailored twice since to keep it fitting right. He'd never seen Emma in her element like this before, surrounded by people who spoke the same language of quarterly projections and market disruptions. She moved through the crowd with an ease he envied, shaking hands with professors who probably made more in a semester than he made in 3 years. But every few minutes, her eyes would find his across the room, and she'd give him that smile, the one that said, none of this mattered as much as having him there to see it. Jake tugged at his collar, the fabric stiff against his neck. His hands, scrubbed clean but still bearing the permanent stains of wood stain and honest work, felt too rough against the champagne flute someone had pressed into his palm. He'd been to fancy events before. Emma had insisted on bringing him to a few gallery openings and charity dinners over the past 6 months, but this felt different. This was her world celebrating her achievement, and he was acutely aware that he didn't belong in any room that required a jacket and tie. A waiter in a crisp white shirt glided past with a tray of hors d'oeuvres that probably cost more than Jake spent on groceries in a week. He declined with a polite shake of his head, his stomach too knotted to think about food. Emma had been nervous about today, not about walking across the stage or giving her speech as class treasurer, but about him being here. She'd tried to hide it, but he'd seen the way she'd practiced introducing him to people, the slight pause before she said, "Carpenter," like she was bracing for their reaction. "You must be Jake." The voice came from behind him, smooth and controlled, carrying the kind of authority that made people straighten their spines without thinking. Jake turned slowly, already knowing who he'd see but still unprepared for the full force of Victoria Sterling's presence. She stood there in a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than his truck, her silver hair swept back in a way that looked effortless but had likely taken a team of professionals to achieve. Her jewelry was understated but unmistakably expensive, the kind of pieces that whispered rather than shouted about wealth. "Mrs. Sterling," Jake said, extending his hand. "It's good to finally meet you." She looked at his offered hand for just a moment too long before taking it with the kind of handshake that felt more like a business transaction than a greeting. Her skin was soft, manicured, unmarked by anything rougher than a keyboard. Jake was suddenly conscious of the callus on his palm, the scar across his knuckles from a saw that had kicked back 2 months ago. "Yes," Victoria said, releasing his hand quickly. "Emma has mentioned you." The way she said it made it clear that whatever Emma had mentioned hadn't been entirely positive. Jake felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the one that came whenever he was reminded that he was an outsider looking in. But he forced a smile, the same one he'd perfected in job interviews and parent-teacher conferences, where he'd been the only father without a college degree. "She's incredible," Jake said, nodding toward where Emma was now talking animatedly with a distinguished man in a professor's robes. "You should be proud." Victoria's gaze followed his, and for a moment her expression softened with genuine maternal pride. "I am. Emma has exceeded every expectation I had for her, and my expectations were considerable." There was something in her tone that made Jake think this wasn't just small talk. Victoria Sterling hadn't approached him to exchange pleasantries about the weather or compliment the venue. She had an agenda, and Jake could feel it pressing against the polite veneer of their conversation like water against a dam. "She tells me you work with wood," Victoria continued, her attention returning to him with laser focus. "I'm a carpenter," Jake said simply. "I also run a community center in Queens. Teach kids some basic skills." How noble. The word dripped with the kind of condescension that only came from people who'd never had to worry about making rent. "And you have a son?" "Dany, he's 16. Victoria nodded, as if she was checking items off a mental list. "Emma mentioned he's quite fond of her. She's been good to him," Jake said carefully, sensing the conversation was moving toward dangerous territory. "She tutors him in math sometimes. Helps with his college applications." "College?" Victoria repeated the word like she was tasting something bitter. "And how exactly do you plan to pay for that? A carpenter's salary must be limited." The question hit like a slap, not because it was cruel, but because it was accurate. Jake had been lying awake at night for months, running numbers that never added up, applying for every scholarship and grant he could find. Dany was smart, brilliant, even but smart didn't pay tuition at the schools he deserved to attend. "We'll figure it out," Jake said, his voice steady despite the heat creeping up his neck. "We always do." Victoria smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I'm sure you will. You seem like the resourceful type." She paused, taking a sip of champagne while her eyes never left his face. "Tell me, Jake, what do you see when you look at my daughter?" The question caught him off guard, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he knew it so completely it made his chest ache. "I see someone who's brilliant and kind and stronger than she knows. I see someone who cares about making things better for people who don't have what she has. I see someone who makes me want to be better than I am." Victoria's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes, surprise maybe, or disappointment, that his answer wasn't what she'd been hoping for. "And what do you think she sees when she looks at you?" Jake felt the ground shifting beneath him. This wasn't a conversation anymore, it was an interrogation, and he was failing a test he hadn't known he was taking. "You'd have to ask her." "Oh, I think I know." Victoria set down her champagne flute on a nearby table with a precision that felt deliberate. "Emma has always been drawn to causes, to projects. Even as a child, she brought home stray cats and wounded birds, convinced she could fix them with enough love and attention." The words landed like punches, each one carefully aimed. Jake felt his hands clench into fists at his sides, but he forced them to relax. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. "I don't think I'm following," he said quietly. "Aren't you?" Victoria stepped closer, lowering her voice so that anyone watching would think they were having an intimate conversation. "You're a project, Jake. A noble cause. Emma sees your struggles, your limitations, and she thinks she can love you into something more than what you are. But love doesn't change fundamentals." Jake felt something cold settling in his stomach. "And what exactly do you think my fundamentals are?" Victoria's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "You're a high school dropout with calloused hands who fixes things for a living. You live paycheck to paycheck in a neighborhood most of my daughter's friends wouldn't drive through. You have a teenage son you can't afford to send to college, and you think that somehow your affection for Emma is enough to bridge a gap that's measured in billions of dollars." Each word was delivered with surgical precision, designed to expose every insecurity Jake had tried to bury. He thought about the nights he'd lain awake wondering what Emma saw in him, the moments when he'd caught her friends looking at him like he was a curiosity, the way conversations died when he mentioned where he lived or what he did for work. "Emma is destined for extraordinary things," Victoria continued. "She has offers from 3 different investment firms, each one worth more in starting salary than you'll make in 5 years. She could have her pick of men Harvard MBAs, tech entrepreneurs, political rising stars. Men who can match her intellect, her ambition, her social standing." Jake found his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended. "And you think I'm holding her back from all that?" "I think you're a detour," Victoria said. "A scenic route through poverty and limitation that she'll eventually tire of when reality sets in. The question is whether you love her enough to save her the pain of that realization." She reached into her purse, designer leather that probably cost more than Jake's monthly rent, and pulled out a checkbook. The gesture was so casual, so practiced, that Jake realized this wasn't the first time Victoria Sterling had solved a problem with money. "I'm prepared to offer you $50,000, she said, clicking open a gold pen that caught the light like a blade. "Enough to pay for your son's college education, maybe even get your little community center some proper funding. All you have to do is walk away from Emma. Cleanly, completely. Tell her you've realized you want different things, that you're not ready for the kind of relationship she deserves." Jake stared at the checkbook, at the pen poised over the paper, at the woman who thought she could buy him like a piece of furniture for her daughter's life. The number echoed in his head: $50,000. It was more money than he'd ever seen at one time, enough to change everything for Dany, enough to expand the programs at the center that had been cut due to funding. "You're serious," he said. "Completely." Victoria's pen didn't waver. "I've done my research, Jake. I know about your wife's medical bills, the bankruptcy, the nights you worked 3 jobs just to keep a roof over your son's head. I know you've been living on fumes and determination for 8 years. This is your chance to finally breathe." The mention of Sarah hit like a physical blow. Jake's wife had been gone for 8 years, but Victoria Sterling had reduced her to a line item in a financial report: medical bills and bankruptcy, as if the love of his life was nothing more than a debt to be calculated. "You investigated me," Jake said, and it wasn't a question. "I protect what's mine," Victoria replied without a hint of shame. "Emma is my daughter, my heir, the future of everything I've built. I won't stand by and watch her throw that away for a fantasy." Jake looked across the room, where Emma was now standing with a group of professors, gesturing animatedly about something that had clearly captured her imagination. Her face was bright with excitement, and Jake could see the woman she was becoming: confident, passionate, ready to take on the world. For a moment, he let himself imagine what Victoria's offer could mean. Dany at Columbia or Harvard, the community center with enough funding to serve twice as many kids, a future where he wasn't constantly calculating whether they could afford groceries and rent in the same month. But then Emma turned, as if sensing his gaze, and smiled at him across the crowded room. It was the same smile she'd given him 6 months ago when she'd first walked into his woodworking class, curious and unafraid. The same smile she wore when she fell asleep on his couch after helping Dany with calculus homework. The same smile that had slowly, carefully, rebuilt something in him he'd thought was broken forever. Jake turned back to Victoria, who was watching him with the patience of a predator who knew her prey was cornered. "You want to know what I see when I look at Emma?" he asked quietly. "I believe I already do." "No," Jake said, and for the first time since the conversation began, his voice carried weight. "You don't. Because if you did, you'd know that she's not some fragile princess who needs protecting from the real world. She's not a project or a cause or a woman who makes decisions based on what other people think she should want." Victoria's expression shifted slightly, the confident smile faltering around the edges. "6 months ago, my son asked me if I thought his mom would be proud of the man I'd become," Jake continued, "and I realized I couldn't answer that question because I'd spent 8 years just surviving, just getting through each day without falling apart. I'd forgotten what it felt like to build something, instead of just maintaining what was left." He paused, watching Victoria's face as she tried to read where this was going. "Then Emma walked into my workshop," Jake said. "Not because she felt sorry for me or because she was looking for a project to fix. She came because she wanted to learn something real, something that couldn't be taught in a boardroom or bought with a check. And you know what she saw in me? Not someone who needed saving, but someone who had already saved himself and his son from the worst thing that could happen to a family." Victoria's pen had stopped moving. The checkbook remained open, but her hand was no longer steady. "She saw that losing everything had taught me what actually mattered," Jake continued, his voice gaining strength. "That raising a son alone had made me understand responsibility in ways that trust funds and safety nets never could. That building something with my hands, something useful and lasting, was worth more than any stock portfolio." "That's a beautiful sentiment," Victoria said, but her voice had lost some of its earlier authority. "But sentiment doesn't pay for graduate school or secure a future." "You're right," Jake said. It doesn't. But it builds character. It builds resilience. It builds the kind of strength that comes from knowing you can lose everything and still find a way to keep going. And that's what Emma sees in Minot, someone who will hold her back, but someone who will stand beside her when the world tries to knock her down. He looked at the checkbook again, at the number that could solve so many problems, and felt something settle in his chest. Your daughter doesn't need a man who can match her bank account, Mrs. Sterling. She needs someone who can match her heart. Someone who understands that real wealth isn't what you accumulate, it's what you're willing to sacrifice for the people you love. Victoria's face had gone pale, her composure cracking like ice under pressure. You think you know her better than I do? I'm her mother. I've planned her future since before she could walk. And that's the problem, Jake said gently. You've been planning her future instead of letting her choose it. Emma doesn't want to be a chess piece in someone else's game, even if that someone is you. She wants to build something of her own, something that matters to her. He stepped closer, close enough that Victoria had to look up to meet his eyes. Your offer tells me everything I need to know about how you see your daughter. You think she's weak enough to be manipulated, shallow enough to be bought, and foolish enough to fall for someone who doesn't deserve her. But I know Emma, and she's none of those things. She's strong enough to make her own choices, deep enough to see past surfaces, and wise enough to know the difference between love and convenience. Victoria's hand was shaking now as she closed the checkbook and returned it to her purse. You're making a mistake, she said. But the words lacked conviction. Maybe, Jake admitted. But it's Emma's mistake to make, not yours. And if she decides I'm not worth the trouble, that's her choice too. But I won't make that decision for her, and I sure as hell won't let you buy it from me. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Around them, the reception continued laughter and conversation and the clink of champagne glasses, but in their small corner of the world, something fundamental had shifted. You have no idea what you're giving up, Victoria said finally. Jake looked across the room again, where Emma was now walking toward them, her face bright with excitement about something she was eager to share. Actually, he said, I know exactly what I'm keeping. And as Emma approached, her smile widening when she saw them together, Jake realized that for the first time since Sarah's death, he wasn't afraid of losing everything, because he'd already learned the difference between what could be taken and what could never be touched, and love, real love, belonged to the second category. Victoria Sterling might have billions of dollars and decades of business experience, but she'd just learned something that couldn't be taught in any boardroom. Some things simply weren't for sale. 6 months earlier, Emma Sterling had stood in the doorway of the Queensbridge Community Center with a clipboard in one hand and doubt in the other. The building was nothing like the gleaming nonprofit offices where she usually volunteered, places with marble lobbies and donor walls that read like a Forbes list. This was a converted warehouse with chipped paint and fluorescent lights that hummed too loudly, the kind of place her mother would have driven past without a second glance. But Emma had found it deliberately, buried 3 pages deep in a Google search for Community Service Queens volunteer opportunities. She'd grown tired of charity galas where the cost of a single table could feed a family for months, tired of writing checks that felt more like social currency than genuine help. She wanted to do something real, something that required more than her trust fund and her connections. You here for the orientation? A woman with graying braids and paint-stained fingers looked up from behind a desk that had seen better decades. Her name tag read Marlene, and her smile was warm despite the obvious curiosity in her eyes. Emma didn't look like their typical volunteer, not in her designer jeans and cashmere sweater, not with the kind of manicure that spoke of weekly salon appointments. Yes, Emma said, suddenly self-conscious about the Louis Vuitton bag hanging from her shoulder. I called about the tutoring program? Marlene's smile widened. Emma Sterling, right? Welcome to the madhouse. Follow me, honey. I'll show you around. The tour was a revelation. The center occupied most of the building's first floor, a large main room with mismatched furniture where kids of all ages hunched over homework and art projects, several smaller rooms set up for different activities, and a kitchen that smelled like industrial coffee and something someone had burned for lunch. It was loud and chaotic and alive in a way that Emma's usual volunteer venues never were. "We serve about 200 kids a week," Marlene explained as they walked past a group of teenagers playing chess. After-school programs, tutoring, job skills training for the older ones. Most of these kids don't have anywhere else to go between 3 and 6. Parents working multiple jobs, tiny apartments, not exactly conducive to homework time. Emma nodded, taking it all in. "What kind of job skills training?" "Depends on what volunteers we can get. We've got someone who teaches basic computer skills, another who does resume writing. But the most popular program is Jake's woodworking class." Marlene gestured toward a set of double doors at the far end of the main room. "Want to see?" The woodworking shop was a different world entirely. The chaos of the main room gave way to focused concentration, the sound of sanders and handsaws mixing with quiet conversation. A dozen teenagers worked at various stations, their attention fixed on projects in different stages of completion. And moving between them like a conductor orchestrating a symphony was the man Emma would later learn to love. Jake Martinez was nothing like the men in Emma's usual orbit. He wore work boots and jeans with permanent stains, a flannel shirt rolled up to reveal forearms marked with old scars and fresh sawdust. His hair was dark with premature threads of silver, and when he smiled at something, one of the kids said, Emma noticed the lines around his eyes, the kind that came from squinting against sun and worry, not from designer eye cream. But it was the way he moved through the space that caught her attention. He had the easy confidence of someone completely in his element, checking on projects with genuine interest, offering suggestions without taking over, celebrating small victories like they were major achievements. When a girl about 15 held up a jewelry box she'd been sanding, Jake's face lit up like she'd just shown him the Mona Lisa. "That's beautiful work, Keisha," he said, running his finger along the smooth edge. "Your grandmother's going to love it." "You think so?" The girl's tough exterior cracked just enough to show the pride underneath. "I know so. That's heirloom quality right there." Emma watched from the doorway as Jake moved to the next station, where a boy who couldn't have been more than 13 was struggling with a piece that kept splitting. Instead of taking over, Jake knelt beside him, his voice too low for Emma to hear but his patience visible in every gesture. Whatever he said worked. The boy's shoulders relaxed, and he picked up his tools with renewed determination. "Jake's been volunteering here for 3 years, Marlene said quietly. "Lost his wife in a car accident, needed something to keep himself busy while his son was at school. Turned out he was exactly what we needed. Half these kids don't have father figures at home, and Jake, well, he's got enough heart for all of them." Emma felt something stir in her chest, a recognition she couldn't name. "What does he do?" "For work, I mean. Runs his own carpentry business. Nothing fancy. Mostly repairs and renovations for people who can't afford the big contractors. But he builds furniture on the side, beautiful stuff. He donated all the workbenches and tool storage you see in there." As if sensing he was being watched, Jake looked up from the boy's project and met Emma's eyes through the doorway. For a moment they just looked at each other across the room full of teenagers and power tools. His expression was curious but not unwelcoming, and when Emma found herself stepping into the workshop almost without thinking, he straightened and wiped his hands on a rag. "You must be the new tutor," he said, walking over with that same easy confidence she'd noticed before. Up close, Emma could see that his eyes were brown with flecks of gold, and that the scar running along his left hand was old and precise, like he'd learned to work around it long ago. "Emma," she said, extending her hand. "Emma Sterling." "Jake Martinez." His handshake was firm and warm, his palm rough with calluses that spoke of years working with his hands. "Welcome to organized chaos." Emma laughed, surprised by how comfortable she felt despite being completely out of her element. "It's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" She looked around the workshop, at the teenagers bent over their projects with the kind of focus she rarely saw in her business school classmates. Something more structured, I guess. More like school. Jake's smile was knowing. "Structure's overrated. These kids get plenty of that between 7 and 3. Here, they get to build something they actually want. something they can take home and be proud of. Amazing what that does for a person's confidence. There was something in the way he said it that made Emma think he wasn't just talking about the teenagers. Did you always know you wanted to work with kids? God, no, Jake laughed, but there was a shadow in it. 3 years ago, I could barely take care of my own kid, let alone anybody else's. But sometimes you find yourself exactly where you need to be, even if you didn't know you were looking. Before Emma could ask what he meant, one of the boys called out for help with a measurement, and Jake was moving again, leaving Emma standing by the door with questions she couldn't voice and a feeling she couldn't name. The tutoring session that followed was a disaster. Emma had imagined herself helping with calculus or essay writing, subjects where her Columbia education would actually be useful. Instead, she found herself sitting across from an 8-year-old named Miguel who needed help with basic addition and a 14-year-old named Jasmine who was failing English because she'd missed half the semester taking care of her baby brother, while her mother worked double shifts. Emma had never tutored children before, had never needed to break down concepts into smaller pieces or find creative ways to make math interesting. Her own education had been private schools and private tutors, summers at academically rigorous camps, the kind of background that prepared you for standardized tests but not for explaining fractions to a kid who was more worried about whether there would be food at home than whether he understood denominators. By the time the session ended, Emma felt like she'd failed everyone who'd sat across from her. Jasmine had given up on the essay after 20 minutes, and Miguel had spent more time drawing airplanes in his notebook margins than working on math problems. Emma was packing up her things when Jake appeared beside her table. "Rough first day?" he asked, but his tone was kind, not mocking. "Understatement," Emma said, shoving papers into her bag with more force than necessary. "I don't think I helped anyone. That girl Jasmine barely spoke to me, and Miguel. I'm pretty sure he knows more about addition than I do about teaching it." Jake pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, his presence somehow both solid and gentle. "You know what your problem is?" Emma looked up, expecting another lecture about connecting with underprivileged youth or understanding different learning styles. "I'm sure you're going to tell me. You're trying too hard to be perfect." Jake's brown eyes held hers steadily. "These kids don't need perfect. They get enough judgment at school, at home, from the world in general. What they need is someone who shows up, who cares enough to try even if they fail." "But I did fail," Emma said. "Jasmine gave up, and I didn't know how to help her." "Did you give up on her?" Emma thought about it. "No. I kept trying different approaches, even when none of them worked." "Then you didn't fail. You just had a first day." Jake's smile was warm and reassuring. "You think I knew what I was doing when I first walked in here? I offered to teach basic carpentry because I figured, how hard could it be? First day, this kid Marcus nearly took his finger off with a chisel because I forgot to teach him how to hold it properly. Marlene banned me from sharp tools for a month." Despite herself, Emma found herself smiling. "What did you do?" "Learned how to teach, started over. Figured out that these kids don't need someone who knows everything, they need someone who gives a damn." He paused, studying her face. "Question is, do you give a damn, or are you here because it looks good on a resume?" The question should have offended her. Emma had gotten used to people assuming she was privileged and shallow, that everything she did was calculated for maximum social benefit. But something about Jake's directness, the way he asked without judgment, made her want to answer honestly. "I give a damn," she said quietly. "I just don't know if I'm good at this." "Nobody's good at anything the first time," Jake said. "But showing up is half the battle. You willing to show up again next week?" Emma looked around the community center, at the kids still bent over homework and art projects, at Marlene organizing supplies with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to stretch every dollar. It wasn't comfortable or familiar or anything like the volunteer work that would look impressive on her graduate school applications, but it was real in a way that felt both foreign and necessary. "Yeah," she said. "I'll show up." That was how it started, not with romance or drama, but with quiet persistence and the gradual realization that sometimes the most important lessons came disguised as failures. Emma returned the following week, and the week after that, she learned to break down complex problems into manageable pieces, to celebrate small victories, to sit with frustration without taking it personally. She learned that Miguel drew airplanes because his father was deployed overseas, and that Jasmine had been taking care of her family since she was 12 and had never had anyone believe she was smart enough for college. And gradually, almost without realizing it, Emma began looking forward to the hour after tutoring when the workshop would empty out and Jake would clean up while she organized her materials. Their conversations started casually. How was your day? What are you working on? Did you see what Keisha made this week? But they slowly deepened into something more substantial. Jake told her about losing Sarah, about the months when he'd barely been able to get out of bed, let alone take care of a grieving 8-year-old son. He talked about learning to braid hair from YouTube videos and burning dinner so many times that Dany had learned to cook scrambled eggs by the time he was 9. He spoke about the community center the way other people talked about churches, a place that had saved him when he didn't know he needed saving. Emma found herself sharing things she'd never told anyone, about the pressure of being Victoria Sterling's daughter, about the way people looked at her and saw dollar signs instead of a person. She talked about business school and the nagging feeling that she was being prepared for a life that didn't actually fit her, about wanting to do something meaningful but not knowing what that looked like. "What would you do if money wasn't a factor?" Jake asked one evening as they walked to the subway together. It had become their routine. Jake would offer to walk her to the station, and Emma would accept even though she could have easily called her driver. "That's the problem," Emma said, pulling her coat tighter against the October wind. "Money's never been a factor for me. I've never had to think about rent or groceries or whether I could afford to take a job I actually wanted. It makes everything feel arbitrary." Jake was quiet for a moment, their footsteps echoing off the sidewalk. The neighborhood around the community center was nothing like the Upper East Side where Emma lived, small apartments above bodegas, kids playing soccer in parking lots, the kind of working-class area that her mother would describe as transitional, with the particular disdain reserved for places that hadn't been gentrified yet. "You know what I thought, the first time I saw you," Jake said finally, "that I was completely out of place? That you looked lost." He stopped walking and turned to face her. "Not geographically lost. Deeper than that? Like you were looking for something but weren't sure what it was." Emma felt something tighten in her chest. "And now?" Jake's smile was soft in the glow of the streetlight. "Now I think you're starting to find it." Their first real conversation outside the community center happened a week later, when Jake found Emma sitting on the steps outside the building 20 minutes before tutoring was supposed to start. She was staring at her phone with the kind of intensity that meant bad news, and when she looked up, Jake could see she'd been crying. "You okay?" he asked, sitting down beside her without waiting for an invitation. Emma wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture so unguarded that it made Jake's chest ache. "My mother's assistant just called. Apparently, I'm supposed to be at some charity board meeting right now. Something about a children's hospital gala that I completely forgot about." "Shit," Jake said, then immediately looked apologetic. "Sorry, no, that's exactly right, shit." Emma laughed, but it came out shaky. "I've been on this board since I was 18, and I hate every minute of it. We spend 2 hours arguing about centerpieces and silent auction items while pretending we care about sick kids. But if I don't show up, my mother will spend the next month reminding me about responsibility and family obligations and how fortunate I am to be in a position to help others." Jake studied her profile in the fading afternoon light. "So why don't you go?" "Because I'd rather be here," Emma said simply. "I'd rather help Miguel with his math homework than listen to a bunch of rich women pat themselves on the back for writing checks. Does that make me a terrible person?" "It makes you human," Jake said, "and it makes you honest about what actually matters to you." Emma turned to look at him, really look at him. "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "Make everything seem so simple. Like the answers are obvious when they feel impossible to me." Jake was quiet for a moment, considering. Maybe it's because I've had to rebuild everything from scratch. When you lose it all, house, savings, the future you thought you were going to have, you learn pretty quickly what's essential and what's just noise. Your charity board might do good work, but if it's not feeding your soul, if it's not making you feel like you're contributing something real to the world, then what's the point? The point is that it's expected, Emma said. The point is that it's what sterling women do. We write checks and show up and smile for pictures and pretend that's enough. Is it enough? For you? Emma looked down at her hands, at the engagement ring she wasn't wearing from the fiancé she'd broken up with 6 months ago because he'd felt more like a business merger than a relationship. No, it's not. That night, Emma skipped the board meeting. She helped Miguel master double-digit addition and listened to Jasmine read an essay about her dreams of becoming a nurse. She stayed after to help Jake clean up the workshop, and when he asked if she wanted to grab coffee, she said yes without thinking about her mother's disapproval or what her friends would think about the diner with the cracked vinyl booths and the coffee that came in thick white mugs. They talked until the diner closed, about everything and nothing. Jake told her about Dany's latest obsession with marine biology and his own father, who died when Jake was 17, leaving him to figure out manhood on his own. Emma shared stories about boarding school and summers in the Hamptons that felt more like prisons than privileges, about the loneliness of being surrounded by people who wanted to be close to your money but not to you. You know what's funny? Emma said as they walked toward the subway. I have everything my mother thinks I should want: education, opportunities, financial security, but I feel more myself sitting in that diner with you than I do at most of the places I'm supposed to belong. Jake stopped walking. They were standing under a streetlight, and Emma could see something shift in his expression, something that made her pulse quicken. Emma, he said quietly, I need you to understand something. I'm not your charity project, and this can't be your rebellion against your mother. If we're going to do this, whatever this is, it has to be real. This is real, Emma said, stepping closer. This is the most real thing in my life. Jake searched her face, looking for doubt or uncertainty. Instead, he found the same steady honesty that had drawn him to her from the beginning. When he kissed her, it was gentle and careful, like he was afraid she might disappear if he held on too tightly. But Emma kissed him back with a certainty that surprised them both, her hands fisting in his jacket as if to prove she wasn't going anywhere. Their relationship developed slowly, carefully, like something they were both afraid to break. Coffee after tutoring became dinner at small restaurants in Jake's neighborhood, places where the food was good and the prices were reasonable and nobody cared about designer labels or trust funds. Emma learned to navigate Jake's world, the bodega owner, who always asked after Dany, the elderly woman upstairs who brought them homemade soup when she heard one of them coughing, the rhythm of a community that looked out for each other not because it was profitable but because it was right. Jake's apartment was a revelation. It was small and clearly budget-conscious, but every piece of furniture was beautiful in its simplicity. He'd built most of it himself, the dining table with its smooth, honey-colored finish, the bookshelves that fit perfectly in the alcove by the window, the coffee table with hidden storage where Dany kept his art supplies. It was the kind of space that felt lived in and loved, where every object had a purpose and a story. You made all this? Emma asked the first time she came for dinner, running her hand along the table's edge. Couldn't afford to buy new, couldn't stand to live with other people's cast-offs, Jake said, pulling plates from a cabinet he'd clearly built to match the kitchen's odd proportions. Turned out I liked making things that would last. Dany was 16 but seemed older, the kind of self-sufficiency that came from growing up with a single parent who worked long hours. He was polite but reserved with Emma at first, clearly protective of his father and suspicious of anyone who might disrupt their carefully constructed stability. But Emma didn't try to win him over with expensive gifts or forced enthusiasm. Instead, she asked about his marine biology project and listened with genuine interest as he explained the differences between various coral reef ecosystems. She's not like your usual type, Dany said to his father one evening when Emma was helping with dishes and thought she was out of earshot. What do you know about my type? Jake asked, amused. Well, for one thing, you've never had a type before, you haven't dated anyone since Mom died. Emma felt something catch in her throat. She'd known Jake was a widower, but hearing it said so matter-of-factly by his teenage son made the loss feel immediate and real in a way it hadn't before. Emma's different, Jake said quietly. Yeah, Dany agreed. She actually looks at you like you're interesting, instead of like she's doing you a favor. It was the closest thing to approval Emma had gotten, and it meant more than any endorsement from her business school classmates or mother's social circle ever could. The first time Emma brought Jake to her world was a disaster. It was a gallery opening in Chelsea, the kind of event where the art was secondary to being seen, and the wine cost more per bottle than most people spent on groceries in a month. Emma had warned Jake it would be pretentious, but she'd wanted him to see this part of her life, to understand the world she was expected to navigate. Jake wore his good suit and tried to make conversation with Emma's friends, but the disconnect was immediate and obvious. They talked about trust funds and summer houses, about internships at daddy's companies and graduate programs that were more networking opportunities than education. When someone asked what Jake did, and he mentioned carpentry, the conversation died with the efficiency of a power outage. He seems practical, Emma's friend Madison said later, when Jake was getting them drinks from the bar. The word was delivered with the kind of smile that was meant to seem supportive but felt like a blade. He is, Emma said evenly. I just mean, it's such a change from Richard. Remember how ambitious he was? All those plans for expanding his father's real estate empire? Emma remembered Richard's ambition, how it had felt less like drive and more like hunger, how every conversation had eventually circled back to profit margins and market expansion. She'd broken their engagement because she'd realized she was just another acquisition in his portfolio, valuable for her connections and her trust fund, but not particularly interesting as a person. Jake builds things that matter, Emma said. Richard just bought and sold them. Madison's smile became sharper. Of course. I'm sure your mother loves that about him. Emma hadn't told her mother about Jake yet, and Madison's casual cruelty reminded her why. In Victoria Sterling's world, a man's worth was measured by his net worth, and love was a luxury that came after financial security had been established. Jake would be seen as a distraction at best, a gold digger at worst. That night, as they walked to Jake's truck, Emma could feel the weight of the evening's failures. I'm sorry, she said. That was awful. It was honest, Jake replied. Your friends think I'm not good enough for you. They're probably right. Emma stopped walking. Don't say that. Why not? It's true. I didn't go to college. I don't have a trust fund. I can't take you to Aspen for the weekend or buy you jewelry that costs more than my annual income. Your friend Madison made that pretty clear. Madison's a bitch, Emma said with unexpected vehemence. She's been jealous of everything I've had since we were teenagers, and she'd say anything to make me doubt myself. Jake turned to face her under the streetlight. This isn't about Madison. This is about the fact that we come from different worlds, Emma. Really different. And I need to know that you understand what that means. What does it mean? It means your family's never going to accept me. It means your friends are always going to look at me like I'm the help. It means if we do this, really do this, you're going to have to choose between their approval and being with me. Emma felt tears prick her eyes, not because Jake was wrong, but because he was right. She'd been living in a bubble for months, pretending that love was enough to bridge the gap between their worlds, ignoring the practical realities that would only become more complicated as their relationship deepened. And if I choose you? She asked quietly. Jake's smile was sad and beautiful. Then you choose a life that's going to be harder than anything you've known. You choose a man who can give you love and stability but not luxury. You choose fights with your family and sideways looks from people who think you're slumming it. You choose uncertainty over security. And if I choose them? Then you choose safety? Jake said. You choose the life everyone expects you to live, with a man who looks good on paper and fits into your world without complications. Emma looked down the street, at the gallery where her friends were probably still drinking expensive wine and talking about people who weren't there to defend themselves. Then she looked at Jake, at the man who'd taught her what it felt like to be seen for who she was rather than what she represented. "I've been safe my whole life," she said. "Safe and miserable and pretending that was enough. I don't want safe anymore, Jake. I want real." When Jake kissed her this time, it was with the desperate intensity of someone who'd almost lost something precious. And Emma kissed him back with the fierce determination of a woman who'd finally found something worth fighting for. They both knew it was just the beginning of a battle that would test everything they thought they knew about love and loyalty and the price of choosing happiness over expectation. But in that moment, under the streetlight with the city humming around them, they chose each other over everything else. It would have to be enough. The phone call came at 7 in the morning, 2 days after graduation. Emma was still in bed, wrapped in the oversized Columbia sweatshirt she'd bought in the bookstore, when her phone buzzed with her mother's ringtone. She almost didn't answer. Victoria Sterling didn't call this early unless something was seriously wrong or she was seriously angry. Given the way their last conversation had ended, Emma suspected it was the latter. "We need to talk," Victoria said without preamble. No greeting, no pleasantries, just the crisp efficiency that had built a business empire and intimidated boardrooms for 3 decades. "Good morning to you too, Mother," Emma said, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "My office, 1 hour." The line went dead before Emma could respond. She stared at the phone for a moment, dread settling in her stomach like cold coffee. Victoria's office was neutral territory, in theory all glass and steel and expensive art, designed to impress clients and intimidate competitors. But when Victoria wanted to have a serious conversation, she summoned people there like a queen holding court, using the environment to establish dominance before the first word was spoken. Emma showered quickly and dressed carefully, choosing a navy blazer and slacks that said professional without saying submissive. She'd learned long ago that Victoria respected strength, even when she disagreed with it. The subway ride to Midtown gave her time to think, to prepare for whatever ultimatum was coming. Because it would be an ultimatum, Victoria Sterling didn't call emergency meetings to offer compromise. The Sterling Industries building occupied an entire city block, 47 floors of glass and ambition that had been Victoria's crown jewel since Emma was a child. Emma had grown up in these halls, spending summers and school breaks watching her mother build something extraordinary, from nothing more than determination and an MBA from Wharton. The company had been Victoria's third child after Emma and her brother Michael, and sometimes Emma thought it might have been her favorite. Victoria's corner office was exactly what you'd expect from a woman who'd made the Forbes list 5 years, running floor-to-ceiling windows with a view that stretched to the Hudson, furniture that cost more than most people's cars, and art that whispered rather than shouted about wealth. Victoria sat behind her desk like a general planning a war, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour, her expression unreadable. "Sit," she said, gesturing to one of the leather chairs across from her desk. Emma sat, crossing her legs and folding her hands in her lap, trying to project calm she didn't feel. "What's this about, Mother?" Victoria slid a manila folder across the desk. Emma opened it to find financial documents, bank statements, investment summaries, trust fund distributions. Her trust fund distributions, going back 5 years. "As of this morning, your trust fund access has been suspended," Victoria said, her voice carrying the same tone she used in board meetings. "Your credit cards have been canceled, your apartment lease will not be renewed when it expires next month, and your position on any boards associated with Sterling Industries has been terminated." Emma felt the air leave her lungs. The trust fund wasn't just money, it was freedom, independence, the ability to make choices without worrying about rent or groceries or student loans. It was the foundation that had allowed her to volunteer at the community center, to pursue meaningful work instead of whatever paid the bills. "You can't be serious," Emma said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm completely serious." Victoria leaned back in her chair, studying Emma's face for cracks in her composure. "You are my daughter and my heir, but that comes with responsibilities. One of those responsibilities is making choices that reflect well on this family and this company." "And dating Jake doesn't reflect well?" Victoria's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Dating a carpenter with a criminal record and a history of bankruptcy reflects poorly on your judgment, which reflects poorly on your fitness to eventually run this company. Emma's hands clenched in her lap. Jake doesn't have a criminal record, and the bankruptcy was because of his wife's medical bills, not because he was irresponsible with money. Bankruptcy is bankruptcy, Emma. It shows poor financial planning and an inability to handle adversity. Neither are qualities I want associated with the Sterling name. The casual cruelty of reducing Sarah's death to a financial inconvenience made Emma's stomach turn. His wife died of cancer. They had insurance, but it didn't cover everything. He chose to pay for her treatment instead of protecting his assets. He chose sentimentality over practicality, Victoria corrected. And look where it got him, raising a child in poverty while working manual labor. Is that the kind of decision-making you want influencing your future? Emma stood up, the chair scraping against the polished floor. Jake is the most responsible person I know. He rebuilt his life from nothing, raised an incredible son as a single father, and created something meaningful with the community center. Those aren't failures, they're achievements. Victoria stood as well, her height and the elevated position of her desk giving her a physical advantage she clearly intended to use. They're achievements if you're measuring by emotional satisfaction instead of actual success, but you weren't raised to settle for emotional satisfaction, Emma. You were raised to lead, to build, to create something lasting. Like what? Like this? Emma gestured around the office, at the expensive furniture and impressive view. Like building a company that prioritizes profit over people. Like surrounding myself with people who value my bank account more than my character. Like building a legacy that will outlast you, Victoria said coldly. Like creating opportunities and jobs and stability for thousands of people. Like using your advantages to make a real difference in the world, instead of playing house with a man who will never be able to give you the life you deserve. The life I deserve, or the life you want for me? Victoria's expression shifted slightly, a crack in the armor that revealed something almost vulnerable underneath. The life I worked for 30 years to make possible. The life I sacrificed everything to give you. For a moment, Emma saw past the CEO to the woman who had built this empire while raising 2 children largely alone, who had fought for respect in boardrooms full of men who thought she didn't belong, who had clawed her way to the top through intelligence and determination and sheer force of will. Victoria Sterling had given Emma opportunities that most people could only dream of, and she'd done it while facing obstacles that Emma had never had to consider. But recognition wasn't the same as submission. I'm grateful for everything you've given me, Emma said quietly. But I can't live your life, Mother. I have to live mine. Victoria's vulnerability disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the cold efficiency that had made her legendary in business circles. Then you'll live it without the benefits of being a Sterling. No trust fund, no family support, no safety net. If you want to choose love over security, that's your right. But don't expect me to subsidize your poor judgment. The words hit like physical blows, not because they were unexpected, but because they were final. Emma had always known this confrontation was coming, but she'd hoped that when it arrived, she'd find some way to make her mother understand. Instead, Victoria had drawn battle lines with the precision of a military strategist, and Emma was being forced to choose sides in a war she'd never wanted to fight. "What about Jake?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Victoria's smile returned, predatory and satisfied. "What about him? You offered him money. At graduation." "I did. $50,000 to walk away from you." Victoria didn't even have the grace to look ashamed. He turned it down. "And now? Now the offer is more substantial. Enough to secure his son's education at any university in the country. Enough to expand his little workshop into a real business. Enough to give him everything he could want for his family." Emma felt sick. "How much?" $250,000. Cash. All he has to do is convince you that your relationship was a mistake and disappear from your life permanently." The number echoed in Emma's head like a gunshot. It was more money than Jake had probably seen in his lifetime, enough to transform not just his circumstances but Dany's entire future. It was the kind of offer that could solve every financial worry he'd ever had, the kind of opportunity that most people would be crazy to refuse. "He'll never take it," Emma said, but even as the words left her mouth, she felt doubt creeping in. Because $250,000 wasn't just money, it was Dany's college education, it was security, it was everything Jake had been working toward for years. "We'll see," Victoria said. "Money has a way of clarifying priorities." Emma left the Sterling Industries building feeling like she'd been hollowed out with a spoon. The city moved around her with its usual urgency, but she felt disconnected from it, like she was watching her life happen to someone else. The trust fund suspension meant she had maybe 6 weeks before her savings ran out, maybe 2 months if she was careful. The apartment lease expiration meant she'd need to find somewhere else to live by the end of the month. The board positions had been volunteer work, but they'd looked good on her resume and opened doors that might now be permanently closed. But none of that scared her as much as Victoria's final offer to Jake. Because Emma knew her mother, knew that Victoria Sterling didn't make empty threats or casual promises. The money was real, and it was probably already sitting in an account somewhere, waiting for Jake to claim it. All he had to do was break Emma's heart and disappear. Emma tried calling Jake 3 times on the subway ride back to her apartment. Each call went straight to voicemail, his voice calm and familiar as he asked her to leave a message. She didn't. What could she say? That her mother had just declared war on their relationship? That she was about to lose everything that had given her independence and security? That Victoria had offered him enough money to solve every problem in his life if he just walked away from her? The apartment felt different when she walked in, smaller somehow, like the walls had moved closer together while she was gone. It was a beautiful space, hardwood floors, and exposed brick, floor-to-ceiling windows that let in perfect afternoon light, but it had never really felt like home. It was too perfect, too expensive, too much like something from a magazine spread. Emma had always known it was temporary, a place to live while she figured out what came next. She just hadn't expected next to arrive so suddenly. She tried calling Jake again, voicemail. Then she tried texting, "Need to talk. Something happened with my mother. Please, call me." The response came an hour later. "Sorry, busy with work, talk later." It was wrong, everything about it was wrong. Jake didn't blow her off, didn't send casual texts when something was clearly bothering her. He called back within minutes, showed up at her door, asked what she needed. The distance in those 4 words told Emma everything she needed to know. Victoria had already gotten to him. That evening, Emma drove to Jake's neighborhood in Queens, using the spare key he'd given her to let herself into his apartment. It felt like a violation of trust, but she needed to see him, needed to understand what was happening. The apartment was empty. Jake's truck wasn't in its usual parking spot, and Dany was at a friend's house according to the note stuck to the refrigerator. Emma sat on the couch Jake had built with his own hands and tried to make sense of the day. 6 hours ago, she'd had a trust fund and a family and a future that looked like everything she'd been raised to want. Now she had nothing except a relationship that might already be over and a man who was suddenly too busy to return her calls. She was still sitting there when Dany got home at 9, his backpack slung over one shoulder and his hair damp from what was probably an attempt to rinse chlorine from the community pool. He stopped short when he saw her, surprise flickering across his features. "Hey," he said cautiously. "Dad's not here." "I know. I was hoping to wait for him." Emma tried to smile, but it felt forced. "How was your day?" Dany shrugged, the universal teenage response to adult small talk, but then he looked at her more carefully, and Emma realized that 16-year-old boys who'd grown up with single fathers learned to read emotional distress the way other kids learned to read street signs. "You okay?" he asked, dropping his backpack by the door. "I'm fine," Emma lied. Dany gave her the kind of look that said he'd heard that particular lie before. "Dad's been weird all week. Ever since graduation. He's been working on furniture until like midnight every night, and he's not really talking much." Emma felt something cold settle in her stomach. Jake threw himself into work when he was stressed or upset, but midnight furniture building was extreme even for him. "Has he said anything? About me? About us?" Dany hesitated, clearly torn between loyalty to his father and concern for Emma. "He keeps saying stuff about how you deserve better, how he was stupid to think this could work. But he won't explain what he means." The cold in Emma's stomach spread to her chest. Victoria's poison was already working, her words about Jake not being good enough echoing in his head until he started to believe them. Emma had seen this before, in the weeks after the gallery opening when Jake had pulled back, convinced that the differences between their worlds were too vast to bridge. "Dany," Emma said carefully, "if someone offered your dad a lot of money to make your life better, do you think he'd take it?" Dany's face scrunched up in confusion. "What kind of money?" "Enough to pay for college anywhere you wanted to go. Enough to expand his business, maybe buy a bigger apartment." "Depends," Dany said. "What would he have to do for it?" Emma's throat felt tight. Give up something important to him. Dany was quiet for a long moment, processing the hypothetical with the seriousness of someone who'd learned that adult problems rarely had simple solutions. "Dad doesn't really care about money," he said finally. "I mean, he cares about having enough to take care of me and stuff, but he's not ambitious that way. But if someone convinced him that taking the money would be better for me." Dany trailed off, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Oh, you think someone offered him money to break up with you?" Emma nodded, not trusting her voice. "That's messed up," Dany said with the moral certainty of a teenager. "I mean, really messed up. Who would do that?" "My mother," Dany's eyebrows shot up. "Seriously? Like, she just walked up to him and offered him money to dump you?" "Something like that." Dany flopped down on the couch beside her, suddenly looking much older than 16. "That explains why he's been so weird. Dad's got this thing about charity, about people thinking he needs help. It probably really got to him." Emma turned to face him. "What do you mean?" "After Mom died, people were always trying to help us. Constantly. Bringing casseroles, offering to watch me, trying to give Dad money or furniture or whatever. And some of it was nice, but some of it was." Dany searched for the right words. "Some of it felt like they thought we were pathetic. Like they couldn't imagine how Dad could possibly take care of me by himself." Emma felt her heart break a little more. She'd never thought about what it must have been like for Jake in those first months after Sarah's death, trying to rebuild his life, while well-meaning people constantly reminded him of everything he'd lost. "Dad got really good at saying no," Dany continued. "Even when we needed help, even when it would have made things easier. He said he didn't want me growing up thinking we were charity cases." "But this is different," Emma said. "This isn't charity, this is my mother trying to manipulate him." "Is it different, though?" Dany asked. "I mean, from Dad's perspective? Someone offering him money because they think his life isn't good enough? Because they think he can't provide for me without help? That probably feels exactly like charity to him." Emma closed her eyes, understanding flooding through her with painful clarity. Victoria hadn't just offered Jake money, she'd attacked the foundation of his identity as a provider and protector. She'd made him feel like exactly what he'd spent 8 years proving he wasn't, a man who couldn't take care of his family. "I should go," Emma said, standing up. "I don't want your dad to think I'm ambushing him." "For what it's worth," Dany said as she headed for the door, "I think you're good for him. I've never seen him as happy as he's been these past few months. Don't give up on him just because he's being stupid." Emma managed a real smile for the first time all day. "I won't give up. But I can't fight for someone who doesn't want to be fought for." "He wants to be fought for," Dany said with the confidence of someone who'd been watching his father carefully for 16 years. "He's just scared that you'll figure out you're too good for us and leave anyway. Better to end it now than wait for you to break his heart later." Emma's eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back all day. "I would never—" "I know," Dany said gently. "But Dad doesn't always know that. He's been hurt before." Emma drove home through the dark streets of Queens, past the community center where she'd first fallen in love with Jake's quiet strength, past the diner where they'd talked until closing time, past all the places that had become sacred to her over the past 6 months. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jake. "Sorry I missed you. Dany said you stopped by. Everything okay?" She stared at the message for a long time, thumb hovering over the keyboard. Everything wasn't okay. Her mother had declared war, her financial security was gone, and the man she loved was pulling away because he'd been convinced he wasn't worthy of her. But saying any of that would force a conversation Jake clearly wasn't ready to have. "Fine," she typed back. "Just wanted to see you. Talk tomorrow?" "Maybe. Busy week ahead." Emma set the phone down and cried for the first time since leaving her mother's office, great heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep in her chest. She cried for the relationship that was slipping away, for the future that suddenly felt uncertain, for the man who was so convinced he wasn't enough that he was willing to walk away from the best thing in both their lives. But mostly, she cried because she understood exactly what Victoria had done. Her mother hadn't just offered Jake money, she'd offered him a way to prove he loved Emma more than he loved himself. And knowing Jake, knowing his capacity for sacrifice, and his tendency to put everyone else's needs before his own, Emma was terrified he might actually take it. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of unanswered calls and canceled plans. Jake found excuses to avoid the community center when Emma was there, claimed he was too busy with work to meet for coffee, responded to her texts with increasingly brief messages that felt like polite strangers trying to end a conversation. Emma had never felt so helpless in her life. She was fighting for her relationship with a man who wouldn't engage in battle, trying to prove her love to someone who'd already decided he didn't deserve it. She threw herself into job hunting with desperate intensity, applying for positions at nonprofits and advocacy organizations, anything that would let her use her business degree for something meaningful. But without the sterling name to open doors, without the network of connections that came with being Victoria's daughter, the process was harder than she'd expected. Her savings were dwindling faster than anticipated. She'd never had to budget before, never had to think about the cost of groceries or gas or the 100 small expenses that added up to real money. The apartment search was even worse. Landlords who had been eager to rent to Emma Sterling, daughter of Victoria Sterling, suddenly became much less interested in Emma Sterling, unemployed recent graduate with no credit history separate from her family. The apartments she could afford were tiny and dark, nothing like the spacious, light-filled space she was used to. But Emma gritted her teeth and signed a lease on a studio in Brooklyn, telling herself that downsizing was character building. She tried to stay positive, to focus on building a life that was authentically hers rather than mourning the one she'd lost. But every night, she lay in bed thinking about Jake, wondering if he was building furniture in his workshop until the early hours of the morning, wondering if he missed her as much as she missed him, wondering if Victoria's money was sitting in an account somewhere, waiting for him to claim it. The answer came on a Thursday evening 3 weeks after the confrontation in Victoria's office. Emma was packing boxes in her apartment, preparing for the move to Brooklyn, when her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something made her answer anyway. "Emma? It's Marlene, from the community center." Emma's heart leaped. "Marlene, how are you?" "I'm fine, honey, but I'm worried about you. You haven't been around lately, and some of the kids have been asking where you went." Emma felt a pang of guilt. In all her focus on Jake and her crumbling personal life, she'd abandoned the kids who'd come to depend on her tutoring sessions. "I'm sorry, I've been dealing with some family stuff. Is everything okay there?" "That's what I'm calling about," Marlene said, her voice careful. "Jake's been acting strange lately, working himself to death, barely talking to anyone. And yesterday, this woman showed up asking questions about him." Emma's blood turned to ice. "What kind of woman?" "Expensive clothes, expensive car. Said she was doing some kind of background check. Asked about Jake's work with the kids, whether he was reliable, that sort of thing. Had official-looking paperwork and everything. Victoria was doing reconnaissance, gathering ammunition for whatever her next move would be." Emma felt sick thinking about her mother's investigators poking around the community center, treating Jake's volunteer work like evidence in a criminal case. "Did Jake know she was there?" Emma asked. "I don't think so. She came during the day when he was at his regular job. But Emma, honey, there's something else. Jake came in this morning and said he's taking a break from the woodworking program, said he needs to focus on his business for a while." Emma closed her eyes. Jake loved that program, loved working with the kids, loved seeing them build confidence along with furniture. He wouldn't walk away from it unless something was seriously wrong. "Thanks for calling, Marlene," Emma said. I'll try to figure out what's going on." "You do that, honey. That man's been carrying the weight of the world since his wife died, but these past few months he seemed lighter. Happier. I hate to see him backsliding." After Marlene hung up, Emma sat in her half-packed apartment and made a decision. She'd been respecting Jake's distance, giving him space to work through whatever Victoria had stirred up in his head. But space wasn't working. If anything, it was making things worse, giving him time to convince himself that walking away was the noble thing to do. Emma had never fought for anything in her life. Everything had always been given to her, from education to opportunities to the basic security of knowing she'd never want for anything. But Jake was worth fighting for. Their relationship was worth fighting for. And if that meant going to war with both Victoria Sterling and Jake's stubborn nobility, then that's what she'd do. She was done waiting for other people to decide her fate. It was time to take control of her own story. The text message arrived at 11:30 on a Friday night, 3.5 weeks after Emma had last had a real conversation with Jake. She was lying in bed in her new studio apartment, staring at the ceiling, and listening to her upstairs neighbor's television through walls that were considerably thinner than anything she'd lived with before. The message was from Dany, sent with the desperation of a teenager who'd finally reached his breaking point. "Your mom called Dad tonight. He's going to take the money. I think he's going to sign papers tomorrow. Please help." Emma sat up so fast she nearly fell out of bed. Her hands shook as she typed back. "Where? When?" "Dad's workshop, 2 p.m. Emma, he thinks he's doing the right thing, but he's miserable. He hasn't slept in days, and he keeps talking about how this will give me opportunities, and how sometimes love means letting people go, and it's all bullshit. Please don't let him do this." Emma was already pulling on clothes, her mind racing. Victoria had played her final card, timing the meeting for a Saturday when Emma would be less likely to interfere, when Jake would be alone in his workshop with his thoughts and his guilt and his desperate need to provide for his son. It was masterfully orchestrated, and it was going to work unless Emma did something to stop it. She drove through the empty streets of Brooklyn and Queens with the kind of reckless speed that would have horrified her insurance company, running 2 red lights and taking corners like she was in an action movie. The workshop was in an industrial area near the docks, a converted warehouse that Jake rented for almost nothing because the heating barely worked and the roof leaked when it rained hard. But it was his space, filled with tools he'd accumulated over years and furniture in various stages of completion, the place where he disappeared when the world became too complicated to navigate. Emma had only been there twice before Jake was protective of his workspace, reluctant to let anyone see him in the environment where he was most vulnerable. The first time, she'd been amazed by the beauty of what he created with nothing more than wood and skill and patience. Hand-crafted dining tables that would last generations, bookshelves that looked like they'd grown naturally from the walls they were designed to fill, rocking chairs with joints so perfect they seemed to move like living things. The second time, she'd realized that this was where Jake came to think, to work through problems that couldn't be solved with conversation or logic. He built furniture the way other people wrote in journals, pouring his emotions into every cut and joint and finish. Walking through his workshop was like reading his diary. She could see his grief in the memorial bookcase he'd made after Sarah died, his hope in the crib he'd built when Dany was born, his growing confidence in the increasingly complex pieces he'd attempted as his skills developed. Now, as she parked outside the warehouse at 1:45 in the afternoon, Emma knew she was about to enter a battlefield. Victoria's black sedan was already there, parked with the precision that spoke of a driver who'd been instructed to wait. Jake's truck sat beside it like a beaten dog, rust visible along the wheel wells, and a crack in the windshield that he'd been meaning to fix for months but couldn't afford. Emma took a deep breath and pushed through the heavy door that led into the workshop. The space was exactly as she remembered, high ceilings crossed with exposed beams, windows that had been painted over so many times they barely let in light, the smell of sawdust and wood stain and honest work. But the atmosphere was different, charged with tension that made the air feel thick and difficult to breathe. Victoria stood near the center of the space like a general surveying conquered territory, her tailored coat and leather handbag looking absurdly out of place among the power tools and half-finished furniture. She held a leather portfolio in one hand and wore the expression of someone who was accustomed to getting exactly what she wanted. Across from her, Jake sat on a workbench with his shoulders hunched and his hands clasped between his knees, looking like a man preparing for execution. They both turned when Emma entered, but their reactions couldn't have been more different. Victoria's face hardened with annoyance, her lips pressing into a thin line that suggested Emma's arrival was an unwelcome complication. Jake's expression was more complex relief and guilt and something that might have been hope, all tangled together in a way that made Emma's chest ache. "Emma," Victoria said with forced calm, "this is a private meeting." "Not anymore," Emma replied, walking into the space between them like she was stepping into the middle of a duel. "Jake, please, tell me you haven't signed anything yet." Jake looked down at his hands, unable to meet her eyes. "Emma, you shouldn't be here." "Where else would I be?" She turned to face her mother, and for the first time in her life, Emma felt no intimidation in Victoria Sterling's presence. Anger burned away fear, love dissolved the last remnants of the little girl who'd spent her childhood seeking her mother's approval. $250,000? Really, Mother? That's what you think our relationship is worth? Victoria's composure slipped slightly. "How did you— It doesn't matter how I found out. What matters is that you're trying to buy the man I love like he's a piece of furniture you don't want cluttering up my life." "I'm trying to give him an opportunity," Victoria said, regaining her balance. "And you the chance to build a life with someone who can actually provide for you?" Emma laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Provide for me? Mother, I've been providing for myself for the past month. I've been job hunting and apartment searching and learning how to budget groceries. And you know what I discovered? I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself." "For now," Victoria said dismissively. "But what happens when the novelty wears off? When you get tired of struggling to make ends meet? When you want children and realize you can't afford to give them the opportunities you had growing up?" "Then we'll figure it out," Emma said simply. "The same way millions of other families figure it out every day. The same way Jake figured it out when Sarah died and he was left with an 8-year-old son and a mountain of medical debt." Jake finally looked up, his brown eyes filled with pain. "Emma, please. Your mother's right about some things. I can't give you the life you're used to. I can't send our kids to private schools or take you on vacations to Europe. I can't even promise you financial security." "Did I ask for any of that?" Emma turned to face him fully, and her voice was gentle but unwavering. "In 6 months of being together, have I ever once complained about money? Have I ever made you feel like what you could provide wasn't enough?" "No," Jake admitted quietly. "But that doesn't change the reality of what I am and what I can offer." "What you are," Emma said, stepping closer, "is a man who rebuilds engines and builds furniture and teaches kids that they can create something beautiful with their own hands. What you are is someone who lost everything and found a way to keep going, who raised an incredible son while dealing with grief that would have broken most people. What you are is the most honest, hard-working, genuinely good man I've ever known." Victoria made a sound of impatience. "Sentiment is lovely, Emma, but it doesn't pay college tuition." Emma spun around to face her mother, and Victoria actually took a step back at the fury in her daughter's eyes. "You want to talk about college tuition? Fine. Let's talk about the fact that Jake has been working 3 jobs to save money for Dany's education since the kid was in middle school. Let's talk about the fact that he's applied for every scholarship and grant available, spent hours researching financial aid, done everything possible to make sure his son has opportunities. And yet he still can't afford— He can't afford Columbia or Harvard, no," Emma interrupted. "But Dany can go to a state school and get an excellent education without drowning in debt. He can work part-time and apply for academic scholarships and graduate with a degree that will serve him well." Not every path to success looks like the one you paved for me. Victoria's face was flushed now, her carefully controlled facade cracking under Emma's assault. So, you're content to settle? To live a smaller life than the one you could have? I'm content to live an authentic life, Emma shot back. A life where I'm valued for who I am, not what I inherit. A life where I can make choices based on what matters to me, not what looks good in a society column. She turned back to Jake, who was watching the exchange with something approaching awe. You want to know what I've been doing for the past month? Besides learning how to live without my trust fund? I've been working on a business plan. Jake's eyebrows rose. A business plan? For a nonprofit, Emma said, pulling her phone out and scrolling to a document she'd been refining for weeks. An organization that partners with community centers to provide funding and business development support for programs like yours. Small grants to expand workshops, training for volunteers who want to teach job skills, connections between centers and local businesses looking for skilled workers. She handed him the phone, watching his face as he scrolled through her detailed proposal. I've been in meetings with potential board members, reaching out to foundations, researching similar organizations in other cities. I turned down 3 job offers because I wanted to build something that mattered. Jake looked up from the phone, his expression unreadable. Emma, this is incredible. But the funding alone. I've got seed money lined up, Emma said. Not from my family, from investors who believe in the model. And I've got commitments from several foundations for larger grants once we prove the concept works. Victoria had gone very still, her portfolio forgotten in her hands. You turned down job offers? What job offers? Emma didn't take her eyes off Jake's face. Goldman Sachs offered me a position in their investment division. McKinsey wanted me for management consulting. There was also an opportunity with a private equity firm that would have had me managing portfolios worth more money than most people see in a lifetime. And you said no? Victoria's voice was barely above a whisper. I said no because I realized that success isn't about how much money you make or how impressive your title sounds. It's about whether you can look at yourself in the mirror and feel proud of how you spend your days. Emma moved closer to Jake, close enough that she could see the sawdust in his hair, smell the familiar scent of wood and honest work that clung to his clothes. You taught me that, Jake. You and Dany and the kids at the community center. You taught me that real wealth isn't what you accumulate, it's what you build and who you lift up along the way. Jake's hands were shaking as he handed her phone back. Emma, I don't know what to say. Say you'll work with me, Emma said simply. Say you'll let me fund an expansion of your woodworking program. Say you'll help me prove that this model works so we can take it to centers across the city. But your mother's offer is designed to separate us, Emma finished. She's not offering you money because she believes in your potential, Jake. She's offering it because she wants you gone. There's a difference. Victoria finally found her voice. That's not true. I researched his work, his impact on the community. The offer is legitimate. The offer is manipulation, Emma said without turning around. And it's working exactly as you planned. Jake's so convinced he doesn't deserve happiness that he's willing to sacrifice it for money. You're counting on his nobility and his love for his son to make him walk away from the best thing that's ever happened to both of us. The best thing? Victoria's laugh was sharp and bitter. Emma, you're 24 years old. You've barely lived, barely experienced anything. How can you possibly know what's best for you? Emma finally turned to face her mother, and when she spoke, her voice carried a strength that surprised even her. Because for the first time in my life, I'm making choices based on my own values instead of your expectations. Because for the first time, I'm in a relationship with someone who sees me as a partner, not a prize. Because for the first time, I understand the difference between being cared for and being controlled. The words hit Victoria like physical blows. She clutched her portfolio tighter, her knuckles white against the leather. I have never tried to control you. Everything I've done has been to give you opportunities. You've given me opportunities to live the life you wanted for yourself, Emma said, but you never asked what I wanted. You never considered that I might find fulfillment in something different from what fulfilled you. And what about when you get tired of playing house with a carpenter? Victoria's voice was rising, her careful composure finally cracking completely. What about when you realize that love doesn't pay for medical emergencies or retirement or your children's futures? What about when you wake up in 20 years and realize you could have had so much more? Jake stood up from the workbench, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. "Mrs. Sterling, can I ask you something?" Victoria turned to him with obvious reluctance. "What?" "When you built your company, when you were fighting to be taken seriously in a world that didn't think women belonged in boardrooms, what kept you going?" Victoria blinked, clearly not expecting the question. What does that have to do with anything?" "Humor me," Jake said gently. "What motivated you during the hardest times?" Victoria was quiet for a long moment, her expression shifting as if she was looking back across decades. "I wanted to prove that I could build something lasting," she said finally. "Something that would matter. I wanted to show that success wasn't limited to people who inherited it or married into it." Jake nodded. "And if someone had offered you money to walk away from that dream, to choose security over the chance to build something meaningful, what would you have said?" Victoria's face went pale. "That's not the same thing." "Isn't it?" Jake asked. "You're asking me to take money to walk away from the person who makes me want to be better than I am, who challenges me to think bigger than I ever thought possible. You're asking me to choose financial security over the chance to build something real with someone I love." He looked at Emma, and for the first time in weeks, she saw the Jake she'd fallen in love with, confident, determined, unafraid. "I may not have your money or your connections, Mrs. Sterling. I may not be able to give Emma the material things she grew up with, but I know how to love her without trying to control her dreams. I know how to support her ambitions without making them about me. And I know how to be a partner instead of a parent." Victoria's portfolio slipped from her fingers, papers scattering across the sawdust-covered floor. For a moment, she looked smaller somehow, less imposing, more human. "She's my daughter," she said, and her voice was thick with emotion Emma had rarely heard. "She's my only daughter, and I can't bear the thought of her struggling the way I did." Emma felt tears prick her eyes. "Mom, I'm not going to struggle the way you did. I have advantages. You never had education, connections, a safety net. But more than that, I have Jake. I have someone who believes in me, who wants to build something with me instead of for me." She moved closer to her mother, close enough to see the fear and love and desperate protectiveness in Victoria's eyes. "You raised me to be strong and independent and capable. Trust that those lessons stuck. Trust that I can make good decisions, even if they're different from the ones you would make." Victoria looked around the workshop, taking in the half-finished furniture, the tools worn smooth by years of use, the evidence of Jake's skill and dedication. "This is really what you want?" she asked quietly. "This life, this world?" "I want a life where I matter for more than my bank account," Emma said. "I want to build something that helps people, something that lasts. I want a partner who sees my success as separate from his own, but connected to it. I want what you and Dad had before the company became more important than your marriage." Victoria flinched as if she'd been slapped. Emma's father had died when Emma was 15, and their marriage had been troubled for years before that, strained by Victoria's single-minded focus on building her empire. It was a wound that had never fully healed, a regret that Victoria carried like a stone in her chest. "Your father understood the sacrifices," Victoria said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Dad understood that he came second to Sterling Industries," Emma replied gently, "and he accepted it because he loved you. But I won't accept coming second to my own trust fund, and I won't ask Jake to accept playing second fiddle to your expectations." The silence stretched between them, heavy with years of unspoken tensions and misunderstood motivations. Finally, Victoria bent to gather the scattered papers from her portfolio, her movements slow and deliberate. When she straightened, she looked older somehow, less certain. "I've spent 22 years building security for you," she said quietly. "It's hard to watch you choose uncertainty instead." "I'm not choosing uncertainty," Emma said. "I'm choosing possibility. There's a difference." Victoria was quiet for a long moment, studying Emma's face as if seeing her clearly for the first time. Then she turned to Jake, who had been watching the exchange with careful attention. "You really think you can make her happy?" she asked. "Long term, when the novelty wears off and life becomes routine and difficult?" Jake met her gaze steadily. "I think we can make each other happy. I think we can build something together that's stronger than what either of us could create alone. I can't promise it will be easy, but I can promise it will be real." Victoria nodded slowly, then looked around the workshop again with new eyes. "This nonprofit Emma mentioned you'd really be interested in expanding your programs?" "It's what I dream about," Jake said simply. "Reaching more kids, offering more opportunities. But that takes funding, and funding has always been the limiting factor." Victoria was quiet for another long moment, and Emma could practically see the gears turning in her head, the same analytical process that had built Sterling Industries, applied now to a completely different kind of problem. "What if," Victoria said carefully, "instead of offering you money to leave my daughter alone, I offered to fund your expansion? What if Sterling Industries became a partner in this nonprofit, provided startup capital and ongoing support?" Emma's breath caught. "Mom, I'm not doing this for you," Victoria said quickly, though her eyes suggested otherwise. "I'm doing it because it's a sound investment. Community development, job training, youth programs, these are areas where corporations need to show social responsibility. It would be good for our image." Jake looked stunned. "Mrs. Sterling, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll let me see your program in action before I commit to anything," Victoria said, her business instincts reasserting themselves. "Say you'll work with Emma to develop a proper business plan with realistic budgets and measurable outcomes. Say you'll prove that this isn't just good intentions, it's good business." Emma felt like the floor had shifted beneath her feet. "You're serious? You'd really consider this?" Victoria's smile was small but genuine. "I've built a career on recognizing potential and investing in people who know how to execute vision. Maybe it's time I applied those skills to my own daughter's dreams." She gathered the last of her papers and tucked them into her portfolio with practiced efficiency. "But I want quarterly reports. I want metrics and data and proof that every dollar is being used effectively. This is a business partnership, not charity." "Understood," Emma said, trying to keep the joy out of her voice. Victoria turned to Jake one more time. "And if you hurt her, if you let her down or take advantage of her trust, I will make your life very difficult in ways you can't imagine." Jake's smile was respectful but unafraid. "Mrs. Sterling, if I ever hurt Emma, I'll deserve whatever you do to me." Victoria studied his face for a moment, then nodded curtly. "Good. We understand each other." As she walked toward the door, she paused and looked back at Emma. "For what it's worth, your father would be proud of you. He always said you had more spine than business sense, but he meant it as a compliment." After Victoria left, Emma and Jake stood in the sudden quiet of the workshop, both of them trying to process what had just happened. The portfolio Victoria had brought the contract that would have ended their relationship lay forgotten on a workbench, its pages stirring slightly in the breeze from the open door. "Did that really just happen?" Jake asked finally. Emma moved into his arms, feeling like she was coming home after a long journey. "I think my mother just offered to go into business with us." Jake held her tightly, his face buried in her hair. "Emma, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I pulled away. Sorry I almost signed that damn contract. I just thought, you thought you were protecting me," Emma finished. "You thought you were being noble and self-sacrificing. But Jake, I don't need protecting. I need a partner. I need someone who believes I'm strong enough to choose my own life." Jake pulled back to look at her, his brown eyes clear and determined. "You are. You're the strongest person I know, and I promise I'll never doubt that again." Emma stood on her toes to kiss him, pouring months of frustration and fear and love into the contact. When they broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. "So," Jake said, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, "want to change the world together?" Emma laughed, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. "I thought you'd never ask." Outside, Victoria Sterling sat in the back of her sedan and instructed her driver to take her back to the office. As the car pulled away from the warehouse, she found herself thinking about her daughter's face when she'd talked about building something meaningful, about Jake's steady confidence when he'd spoken of loving Emma without controlling her. For 30 years, Victoria had measured success in dollars and market share, in quarterly reports and stock prices. She'd built an empire by being smarter and tougher and more determined than everyone around her. But watching Emma in that workshop, seeing the way she'd fought for her own vision of success, Victoria realized that maybe she'd been measuring the wrong things all along. Maybe real wealth wasn't what you accumulated, maybe it was what you built and who you lifted up along the way. Maybe her daughter had just taught her something that all her business experience never could. Victoria smiled and pulled out her phone to call her assistant. There was work to do, a non-profit to plan, a partnership to structure. For the first time in years, she was excited about a project that couldn't be measured in profit margins. Emma Sterling was going to change the world, and Victoria was going to help her do it.